Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep today into a topic that touches so many of our lives, something we probably don't think about until maybe we're sitting on the tarmac, the safety of air travel.
Absolutely. And, we've got a stack of fascinating sources in front of us, articles, research reports that give us a really detailed look at where aviation safety stands right now.
Yeah, really digging in.
They cover pretty much everything from global trends and the causes of accidents to what's going on with, say, major manufacturers and even practical tips for passengers.
And our mission in this deep dive is really to cut through all that information. We want to pull out the vital insights, the surprising nuggets, and give you, the listener, a really clear, informed picture of this incredibly complex system.
Exactly. And the first thing that just jumped out from these sources is this interesting dynamic. Aviation has become dramatically safer over the long haul, significantly reducing risk per flight.
Right.
But the last few years, well, they've been a bit of a roller coaster.
Right. It feels like two different stories playing out. So, okay, let's start with that big picture improvement and then dig into the recent volatility.
Sounds good. If we look at, say, the past decade, the sources show a really clear trend. Accident rates and the fatality risk per flight have dropped significantly.
Okay.
Comparing the average from like 2011, 2015 to the more recent 2020, 2024 period, it's a remarkable improvement in safety performance globally.
And 2023 really stands out in the data, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was an extraordinary year for commercial aviation safety. According to the sources, 2023 saw 0 fatal crashes involving large Western-built jet airliners.
0. Wow.
That had never happened before in history, a full year without a single fatality on those types of jets, the most commonly flown around the world.
That's incredible when you think about just the sheer number of flights happening every single day. But then, okay, the post-COVID period hits and things get, well, complicated.
Exactly. When the pandemic hit, flight numbers just plummeted, especially in 2020 and 2021. Now, while there were fewer accidents in, like, absolute terms, the sources note that the accident rate didn't necessarily improve dramatically in those initial years. And that's because some major fatal crashes still occurred despite the really low traffic volume.
Ah, I see. So the rate didn't drop as much as the total number and as traffic rebounded.
Well, in 2022, accident counts initially ticked up slightly, and the global accident rate actually saw a small rise.
Okay.
But then, as we just said, 2023 showed that massive improvement, kind of resetting expectations for safety levels.
Which makes what has happened so far in 2024 a real concern, something highlighted in the sources.
Precisely. The preliminary data for 2024, looking at the table the sources provide, it shows multiple fatal crashes that have kind of reversed that positive trend of 2023. Incidents like the tragic runway collision in Tokyo and other fatal events have prompted safety experts, according to the sources, to call it a wake-up call,
Yeah.
Urging reinforced vigilance and attention across the entire industry.
So the big picture is improvement, definitely. But the recent picture shows some concerning bumps and fluctuations. This, well, it naturally leads us to ask, when accidents do happen, what are the primary causes?
Well, what's fascinating here, and the sources really emphasize this, is that it's very rarely one single thing. Aviation accidents almost always result from a combination of factors, sort of a chain of events where several things go wrong.
A chain reaction, basically. And what are the most common links in that chain, according to what we're seeing here?
Human error remains the most commonly identified contributing factor. Now, this covers a wide range. Pilot mistakes, miscommunication in the cockpit or maybe with air traffic control, and deviations from standard operating procedures. The sources cite the Pakistan International Airlines crash in 2020 as a prominent example, where the investigation focused heavily on the flight crew's reported failure to deploy the landing gear before that initial landing attempt.
Wow. That feels almost basic, but I guess under stress or high workload, it just highlights how critical even those fundamental checks are.
Absolutely. Another key factor highlighted is software and system failures. The sources point to the Boeing 737 MX crashes in 2018 and 2019 as probably the most significant recent examples.
Right, that Amex.
Yeah, those were linked to a flawed flight control software system called MMS.
MAS, remind us, what exactly was that system supposed to do, and how did it go so wrong?
Well, in simple terms, MCS, that's a Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, it was designed to help the 737 MX handle more like the previous versions in certain flight conditions.
Okay.
But the problem was, it relied on data from a single sensor. So a malfunction could cause the system to repeatedly push the aircraft's nose down erroneously. And that required really rapid and precise pilot intervention, which in those tragic cases just didn't happen successfully. It really underscored the potential risks of complex automation.
Yeah, definitely. What about mechanical failures? Are those a common cause? That's often what we fear as passengers, isn't it?
Well, they're much rarer than human factors or system issues, but mechanical failures do still occur, absolutely. The recent Alaska Airlines 737 MAX incident where a door panel detached mid-flight.
Right, the door plug.
Exactly, the door plug. That's a clear example of a mechanical problem rooted in what the sources describe as a manufacturing quality issue specifically. Missing fasteners, missing bolts that should have secured that panel.
And then there are the extremely rare but, well, shocking deliberate actions.
Yes, the sources do mention this as well. The China Eastern crash in 2022 is cited as a case where the investigation reportedly concluded the accident was caused by intentional pilot input rather than a mechanical or system failure.
So pulling all these different causes together, what's the synthesis?
What the sources seem to synthesize is that most recent fatal events reflect a blend of operational factors, often involving pilot actions under stress, sometimes compounded by maintenance issues or, as we saw with the ants, design or manufacturing flaws. It's rarely just one simple thing going wrong in isolation.
Speaking of design and manufacturing flaws, the scrutiny on Boeing has just been intense over the past few years, hasn't it? Especially following those 737 MAX accidents and these more recent incidents.
It really has, and the sources detail some key reasons for that focus. There's a significant emphasis in the material here on a perceived shift in Boeing's corporate culture, particularly after its merger with McDonnell Douglas. Starting in, say, the late 2010s, there's a suggestion that an increased emphasis on production speed and cost-cutting maybe took precedence, leading to, according to the sources, reduced inspections and oversight lapses in manufacturing.
And that pressure, it didn't just affect internal processes, but their suppliers too.
Exactly. The sources highlight that aggressive cost reduction programs strain relationships with their suppliers, who are responsible for manufacturing major sections of the aircraft, like fuselage components. This outsourcing, well, it increases complexity and, as the sources suggest, the potential for defects to enter the manufacturing chain.
And the pandemic then layered another challenge right on top of that.
Absolutely. COVID-19 led to significant workforce changes at Boeing layoffs, buyouts resulting in the loss of experienced staff.
Right.
So when production ramped back up quickly to meet demand, you had potentially less experienced personnel working under pressure. And that, the sources indicate, led to missed defects, like the specific case cited of missing bolts on certain fuselage panels that have caused these recent issues.
How do the sources contrast this picture with Boeing's main competitor, Airbus?
Well, the sources tend to describe Airbus as generally taking a more conservative approach to manufacturing. They seem to have maintained tighter in-house control over key processes, ramped up production more gradually, maybe prioritizing quality control alongside speed. And while Airbus also faced supply chain issues during the pandemic, definitely, they've experienced fewer of these really high-profile, manufacturing-related quality lapses reported in the sources.
It sounds like Boeing is publicly acknowledging the need for change now, though.
Yes, the sources do know that. Boeing has publicly stated a commitment to reforming its safety culture, adding more inspectors on the factory floor and its suppliers, and intentionally slowing down production rates to allow for better quality oversight before aircraft leave the factory.
Okay, let's look directly at the accident table provided in the sources here, comparing Boeing and Airbus involvement in fatal events from, say, 2020 to 2025, based on this data.
Right. The overview in the sources, it shows that Boeing jets have been involved in more fatal events during this specific period. However, and this is crucial, as the sources point out, involvement doesn't always mean the aircraft's design or manufacturing caused the accident.
Right, exactly. Like the Ukraine International Airlines 737 that was shot down in Iran back in 2020.
Precisely. That's listed, obviously, but it's not a manufacturing or design issue. Now contrast that with Airbus. The sources indicate Airbus jets have had fewer fatal incidents in this time frame.
Okay.
And where they have occurred, the causes are more frequently linked to human error or external factors rather than systemic mechanical or manufacturing issues with the aircraft itself again, based on the source data we have here.
Like the Pakistan International Airlines A320 crash in 2020, which was attributed primarily to pilot error, as we mentioned.
Yes.
Or the JAL A350 collision in Tokyo in 2024, caused by a runway incursion by another aircraft, where the A350's design actually allowed for a remarkably successful evacuation despite that fiery collision.
Those examples from the table really illustrate the patterns the sources identify. Now, there are exceptions, of course. There's an Air India Express Boeing runway overrun attributed to pilot error and a Srivijaya Air Boeing crash linked to mechanical issues compounded by pilot actions.
Mm-hmm.
But the overall picture presented suggests Boeing aircraft appearing in more of the fatal incidents in this recent window, sometimes linked to these quality control concerns, while Airbus incidents seem fewer and more often tied back to operational or external factors.
Gotcha. And beyond manufacturing issues, the sources also highlight how the massive disruption of the pandemic really left its mark on the entire aviation system, creating new challenges for safety.
Oh, it certainly did. The post-COVID recovery wasn't just about ramping up flights. It introduced some unique stresses. One significant issue highlighted is skill degradation among flight crews.
Skill degradation? How so?
Well, many pilots flew dramatically less during the pandemic, and the sources suggest this led to increased error rates being observed post-pandemic as, proficiency may have decreased slightly.
Huh. It's like any complex skill. If you don't use it constantly, you can get a little rusty.
Precisely. And then there's also the issue of a pilot shortage. Early retirements and exits during the pandemic created a supply gap, forcing airlines to hire and promote pilots faster, perhaps, than in previous years.
Right.
The sources suggest this could potentially lower the average experience level in the cockpit across the industry compared to pre-COVID.
And the problems aren't just limited to the flight deck, are they?
No, not at all. Air traffic control staffing is another critical area of concern mentioned in the sources. Many ATC facilities are short-staffed, and the sources point out a correlation between this shortage and an increase in operational errors like runway incursions.
Which is when something's on the runway that shouldn't be.
Exactly.
Huh.
Unauthorized presence on a runway and near misses, particularly in the busy airport environment.
Then there was the huge task of getting all those aircraft that have been parked in long-term storage back into service.
Yeah, significant maintenance challenges arose from this. Aircraft reactivation requires extensive procedures. Combine that with shortages of skilled mechanics and pressure to resume operations quickly. Well, the sources indicate concerns were raised about the potential for deferred maintenance or maybe less thorough inspections during that rapid ramp-up.
And just simply the volume of flying returning to normal, that must add pressure to the entire system itself.
Absolutely. As passenger demand surged back, airlines and infrastructure, well, they struggled to keep up. This increased flight volume, according to the sources, contributes to fatigue among crews and ground staff, scheduling strain, and just overall operational stress across the network.
So despite the underlying long-term safety trend being positive, these post-COVID factors present these ongoing challenges that require really careful management. But the industry is aware of these, right? They're working on it.
Yes, absolutely. The sources note that regulatory agencies and airlines are prioritizing addressing these issues in their recovery. They're emphasizing safety first, investing in enhanced training programs, increasing simulator time, and reinforcing oversight systems to mitigate these pandemic-related risks.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. While flying is statistically incredibly safe, far safer than driving, for example, the rare event of an emergency is something that understandably concerns people. What can you, the passenger, actually do to potentially improve your chances in that extremely rare scenario? The sources offer some really practical tips based on accident analysis.
They do, and they're often simple things that can make a real difference. First, maybe consider your seat location. Statistical analysis from some sources suggests that rear seats tend to have slightly higher survival rates in survivable accidents.
The back of the plane, interesting.
Yeah. And within the rear section, middle seats might offer a bit more protection. But probably most importantly, your proximity to an emergency exit is absolutely key for rapid evacuation.
That makes intuitive sense. Getting out fast is paramount.
It is. Second, if instructed, use the brace position. It might feel counterintuitive or look a bit strange.
Yeah.
But it's scientifically designed to help reduce impact trauma to your head and limbs during a sudden deceleration event.
And something simple we should always keep in mind, even when things seem smooth.
Always keep your seatbelt fastened while seated, even if the seatbelt sign is off. Many injuries in aviation aren't actually from crashes, but from unexpected severe turbulence. A fastened seatbelt is your primary defense against those injuries.
Okay, good point. Navigating a damaged cabin, possibly in smoke, sounds terrifying. How do the tips address that scenario?
This is a crucial one. The sources really stress familiarizing yourself with the cabin layout and actually counting the rows to the nearest emergency exit in both directions during boarding.
Counting the rows?
Yeah, because in an emergency with low visibility, like heavy smoke, you may have to navigate by feel alone. Knowing that it's, say, 5 rows forward or 7 rows back could literally be a lifesaver.
Wow, okay, that's practical. And listening to the safety briefing, even if you fly all the time.
Absolutely critical. Passengers who pay attention and actually follow the instructions from the crew during an emergency consistently fare better and evacuate faster. And this is maybe the most important passenger action. Leave your belongings behind.
Don't grab the carry-on.
Do not grab the carry-on. Attempting to retrieve bags during an evacuation causes potentially fatal delays for everyone behind you. The time saved is simply not worth the risk.
What about what you're wearing? Does that actually matter?
Surprisingly, yes. The sources recommend dressing smart for travel, basically. Wearing long sleeves and trousers, preferably made of natural fibers, and closed-toe, sturdy shoes.
Why is that?
Well, it provides protection against fire, heat, and sharp debris if you have to evacuate through hazardous conditions. So, avoid sandals, high heels, or highly flammable synthetic clothing for safety reasons.
Makes sense. And finally, there's the mental aspect, I suppose.
Definitely. The sources highlight that staying as calm as possible, maintaining situational awareness, and being able to act quickly and decisively are critical survival tools. Just mentally preparing yourself, even briefly, can help you react effectively if an emergency occurs. Remember, aircraft cabin safety is designed around that goal of evacuating the entire aircraft within 90 seconds. Even with half the exits blocked, your actions really contribute to making that possible.
Those are incredibly practical, actionable steps derived from actual analysis. Really useful.
Now, let's touch on something often asked. Why don't commercial jets have seemingly obvious safety features, like, say, whole aircraft parachutes or those crash-resistant fuel tanks you might see on some military aircraft?
Yeah, this raises an important question about, really, the feasibility, the cost, and the actual benefit of certain technologies in the commercial airline context, given the physics and operational realities of large jets.
Like whole aircraft parachutes, they exist for smaller planes,
Right.
right? They do, and they're effective there. But for commercial jets, the sources explain they're simply not practical. The weight and bulk of a parachute system large enough for a jet would be absolutely enormous
Huge, yeah.
and consume significant payload capacity. More importantly, most fatal commercial accidents happen at relatively low altitudes or during takeoff and landing phases, basically, below the altitude where a parachute system could realistically deploy and slow the aircraft effectively.
Okay, that makes sense. What about passenger airbags?
They exist in some specialized seating, like certain premium seats or maybe bulkhead rows, primarily to mitigate head impact with bulkheads or screens in front. But they aren't standard throughout the cabin.
Why not?
The sources suggest this is largely due to cost, the complexity of implementation throughout a high-density cabin, and frankly, the fact that structural improvements to seats and the mandatory use of seatbelts already provide more comprehensive protection against impact forces in most scenarios.
And crash-resistant fuel tanks, like on helicopters or military planes.
While effective in their intended applications, implementing them on large commercial jets is incredibly difficult and costly. I mean, we're talking about carrying massive volumes of fuel in the wings and fuselage.
Yeah.
Building truly crash-resistant tanks of that size and complexity is, well, prohibitive. Instead, commercial aviation relies heavily on fire-resistant materials used throughout the cabin, and crucially, on achieving that rapid 90-second evacuation goal to get people away from the aircraft quickly in the event of a post-impact fire.
So it's really about prioritizing what provides the most overall safety benefit and is actually feasible at the scale of commercial operations.
Exactly. Modern aircraft design focuses heavily on preventing accidents from happening at all. That's the primary goal. But cabin safety standards like stronger seats, materials used, that vital emergency floor lighting, they have significantly improved survivability if an accident does occur. The focus is on making the cabin a survivable space and enabling people to get out fast.
Right. Finally, let's look at perhaps the most secure, safest flights in the world. Those carrying heads of state, like, say, the U.S. Air Force One. Why can't that absolute pinnacle of flight safety simply be replicated for everyday commercial travel?
Yeah, what's fascinating here is understanding the sheer scale, the purpose, and frankly, the almost unlimited resources dedicated to VIP flights versus commercial operations. For VIP flights, you have extraordinary, often unique protocols.
Starting with the aircraft itself and the crews, I imagine.
Absolutely. They use specially modified, incredibly rigorously maintained aircraft flown by elite military pilots who train constantly, relentlessly. Beyond standard safety, these aircraft are equipped with complex security systems, things like counter-missile flares, EMP shielding, hardened structures.
Wow.
These systems add immense weight, cost billions, and are designed to protect against threats that commercial flights simply don't face in the same way.
And their operations are completely different too, right?
Totally different. Heads of state flights operate with immense flexibility and priority. They can delay or divert flights basically at will based on weather or security, have backup aircraft ready to go immediately, and receive special air traffic control priority just by identifying themselves.
Okay.
They also undergo incredibly extensive pre-flight inspections and security sweeps before every single flight, which is just not feasible at the scale of routine airline operations with tens of thousands of flights globally each day.
So full replication for commercial airlines is basically a non-starter.
It's completely unrealistic. It's due to the prohibitive weight and cost of those specialized security systems, the irrelevance of many of those specific threats to commercial travel, and most fundamentally, just the sheer operational scale difference. You simply can't ground and meticulously inspect every single commercial jet for hours before every flight.
But have any of those ultra-high safety practices influenced commercial aviation at all?
Yes, absolutely. Some valuable lessons and technologies have filtered down. Reinforced cockpit doors, for example, became standard across commercial aviation, partly due to security concerns highlighted in those high-level security analyses.
Right.
Commercial flights in distress receive emergency ATC priority. That's a concept refined from VIP operations. And advanced crew resource management, or CRM training, which focuses on teamwork and communication in the cockpit. It's a standard part of airline training now, and it draws principles developed in high-stakes environments like military and VIP aviation.
So while your next flight won't have a missile defense system, the pursuit of safety at that absolute highest level does push some beneficial practices into the wider system.
Exactly. It helps raise the bar over time.
So to wrap up this deep dive then, what's the key takeaway message from all these sources about the state of aviation safety today?
I think the overarching insight is that aviation safety is a dynamic system. It's in constant evolution, and over the long term has achieved really remarkable improvements in reducing risk. However,
There's a but.
there's a but. Recent years, particularly impacted by the post-pandemic recovery and the manufacturing scrutiny on certain companies, they really highlight that continuous vigilance and attention to detail at every single level of the system, from the factory floor to the flight deck and air traffic control, are absolutely essential. The long-term gains are real, but these short-term fluctuations and specific systemic issues demand constant attention.
Understanding these layers, from the global trends right down to the challenges facing manufacturers and even what you can do as a passenger, it really gives you a clearer, more informed perspective on the system you're traveling within.
Yeah, it takes you beyond just the headlines to the underlying factors that actually contribute to safety, or sometimes, unfortunately, detract from it.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you to consider as you reflect on all this. Given the complex layers of systemic factors, human elements, and let's face it, economic pressures in aviation, how should the industry best balance that constant drive for efficiency and cost reduction in a really competitive market with the absolute non-negotiable necessity of preventing even a single catastrophic failure? And what does that stark difference in safety protocols between commercial flights and those for heads of state truly reveal about where resources and societal focus are ultimately directed in the pursuit of safety? Something to think about the next time you're sitting in seat 35B, cruising at 35,000 feet.